The plane rumbled softly as it prepared for takeoff, passengers settling into their seats. Some were eager for the journey ahead, while others were exhausted from long hours of travel. But in first class something was wrong. A flight attendant, with golden blonde hair and fair skin, stood tall before a young black teenage girl, arms crossed, her voice sharp and cold. "You don't belong here. Move to economy immediately. Why are you trying to take a VIP passenger seat? This place is not suitable for you." The girl looked up, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, but her grip tightened around her ticket. "First class. Window seat. Paid in full." The flight attendant only shook her head, her expression filled with anger and doubt. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but this seat is not for you. Leave immediately." Humiliation crashed over the girl like a tidal wave. Around her, passengers watched in silence, their gazes heavy but unwilling to intervene. Her heart pounded, hands trembling as she picked up her bag and silently walked toward economy, forcing back tears. But what the flight attendant didn't know was, her father owned the entire airline. And when he found out what had happened, justice would be served, at 35,000 feet. Hello everyone, you are listening to a story from the Soul Deep Stories YouTube channel. This is an emotional and thought-provoking tale. Listen until the end and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. And now let's dive into the story. Seated by the window, Elena gripped her boarding pass tightly. This was her first time flying alone, and inside her, a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbled up. The first-class seat was spacious, far more comfortable than the economy seats she was used to. Her father had given her this ticket as a reward, a gift she was proud of. She pulled her hoodie up, tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her, and put in her earphones ready to enjoy the flight. She didn't want attention, she was just another passenger minding her own business. The aisle buzzed with movement as more passengers boarded. Some chatted happily, while others settled into their seats quietly. Amidst the routine bustle, a flight attendant named Margaret Collins moved through the cabin, methodically checking seatbelts, a polite smile on her lips. But when her eyes landed on Elena, the smile disappeared. Her steps slowed, her once warm demeanor hardening into something colder, more rigid. Margaret's gaze flicked over Elena's casual clothing, then down to her seat number. Slowly she straightened her uniform, inhaled sharply and spoke, her tone firm and unwavering. "Miss, I believe you're in the wrong section." Elena's fingers tightened around the boarding pass still clutched in her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of frustration and disbelief washing over her. She had done nothing wrong. She had her ticket, she was in her assigned seat, so why was she the only one being questioned? Margaret's eyes bore into her, expectant and unwavering, as if waiting for Elena to admit some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake. Elena took a slow, steadying breath. "This is my seat," she repeated, her voice quieter now but firm. Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh, as if she were dealing with a child who refused to follow instructions. "Miss, I won't ask again. First class is reserved for our premium clientele. If you don't move, I will have to involve the crew supervisor." The weight of the stairs around her pressed down like a heavy fog. Some passengers shifted in their seats, a few darting uncomfortable glances toward her before quickly looking away. But no one spoke. No one questioned why she was the only person being singled out. Elena swallowed hard, heat prickling at the back of her neck. "I don't understand," she said, forcing her voice to remain even. "I have a valid ticket. Why are you treating me like I don't?" Margaret pursed her lips, her expression unreadable for a brief moment. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, she said, "Because passengers in first class are expected to meet certain standards." The words landed like a slap. Elena's grip on her bag tightened. She opened her mouth, ready to push back, to demand an explanation, when a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a deep, measured voice said from across the aisle. Both Elena and Margaret turned to see the older businessman, Richard Evans, leaning slightly forward. His sharp blue eyes flickered between the two of them, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm yet pointed. Margaret hesitated. Because from where I'm sitting," Richard continued, his gaze narrowing, "it looks like this young lady has a perfectly valid seat." For the first time Margaret hesitated. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. It was subtle, but Elena saw it, saw the brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face. She wasn't expecting anyone to step in. And neither was Elena. Margaret squared her shoulders. "I'm simply ensuring there are no seating errors, Mr. Evans," she said, her voice smooth but tight. Richard held her gaze for a long moment before exhaling and leaning back in his seat. "Then it seems to me that you've already done your job," he said, his voice neutral. "The young lady has her ticket. There's no error." A silence stretched between them. Margaret's jaw tightened. For a second it looked like she might argue. But then, with an almost imperceptible exhale, she gave Elena one last lingering glance before stepping back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped, before turning sharply on her heel and walking away. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned her head slightly, meeting Richard's gaze. He gave a small nod as if to say that wasn't right. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she didn't feel entirely alone. But she also knew this wasn't over. Margaret might have walked away for now, but Elena had the sinking feeling that there would be consequences for standing her ground. And she had no idea just how right she was. Elena sat stiffly in her new seat, her hands gripping the armrests as if anchoring herself in place. The walls of the economy cabin felt smaller, the air somehow heavier. She could still feel the weight of the stairs from first class, the quiet murmurs that had followed her as she walked down the aisle in humiliation. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting another message from her father. But instead, it was a notification from social media. A travel blogger she followed had just posted about their luxurious flight experience. Elena let out a bitter exhale, locking the screen without looking. Some people got to enjoy their flights. A shadow passed over her. "Would you like a drink?" Elena glanced up to see Hannah Miller, the flight attendant who had noticed her earlier. Unlike Margaret, Hannah's expression wasn't cold or dismissive. Her brows were drawn together in quiet concern. Elena shook her head. "I'm fine." Hannah hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the drink tray. "I saw what happened." Elena looked away. "Did you?" Hannah nodded slowly. "And I don't think it was right." A sharp pang of emotion swelled in Elena's chest, but she swallowed it down. It didn't matter. The damage had been done. She was stuck here now. Hannah crouched slightly, lowering her voice. "Do you want me to report it?" Elena blinked. "Report it? To whom?" "The same people who had already let this happen?" Her fingers curled into the fabric of her hoodie. She wanted to believe someone would listen, that someone would care, but she had already seen how easy it was for people to look the other way. She forced a small, tight smile. "No," she murmured. "It's fine." Hannah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she gave a small nod and stood. "If you change your mind," she said quietly, "I'm here." Then she walked away, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. The hum of the engines filled the silence around her, but inside, her mind was racing. What could her father actually do? The plane was already midair. The flight attendants had made it clear that their decision was final. Would they really listen to someone, even if that someone owned the entire airline? Elena didn't know. But she was about to find out. Because 35,000 feet below, Daniel Carter was already setting things in motion. And this flight? It was about to change course. Margaret's throat tightened as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had spent years enforcing rules, making quick judgments about passengers, handling complaints with detached professionalism. But now she was the one being questioned. And not just by an upset traveler, but by Daniel Carter, the owner of the entire airline. Her fingers twitched at her sides as she fought to maintain her composure. She had always prided herself on staying professional under pressure. But this time? This time was different. "I was simply following protocol," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "There was a seating issue, and I resolved it accordingly." On the screen, Daniel's expression didn't change, but his silence was more unnerving than any reprimand. Captain James Reynolds shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering between them before speaking. "Miss Collins," he said, his tone carefully measured, before asking Miss Carter to move, "did you check the passenger manifest?" Margaret held her breath. She knew the answer and so did they. I made a judgment based on the situation at hand," she said carefully, choosing her words like stepping through a minefield. Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, dangerous. "So no," he stated, his voice carrying the sharp finality of a judge's gavel. "You didn't?" Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. The truth hung between them, undeniable. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "Miss Collins, let's be clear, this isn't just about a mistake," he said. This is about why you made it? Margaret felt a prickle of heat at the back of her neck. She had handled difficult passengers before. She had defused tense situations, managed high-profile first-class travelers, dealt with entitled complaints. But this time she was the problem. The captain cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Mr. Carter has requested that Miss Carter be immediately reinstated to her original seat," he said. "And that you be the one to personally escort her back." Margaret's stomach twisted. Escort her back? Publicly? Passengers would see. They would know. The same people who had watched Elena walk to the back of the plane in humiliation would now witness her return in quiet triumph. And Margaret would have to swallow her pride and make it happen. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to nod. Understood. Daniel's gaze remained cold and unwavering. "Oh, and Miss Collins?" She stiffened. "Yes, sir?" "This conversation isn't over." The screen went dark. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The captain didn't say anything, merely watching her with the same unreadable expression he had maintained throughout the exchange. Finally he gave a curt nod. "You have your orders?" Margaret forced herself to move, each step feeling heavier as she turned and walked out of the cockpit. She had spent years controlling situations like these. But now she wasn't in control at all. And for the first time in her career, she was terrified. Margaret felt her stomach knot. The weight of Daniel Carter's words pressed down on her like a crushing force. "Apologize." In front of everyone. Her pride screamed in protest. She had never been the one to admit fault, never been the one forced to stand in front of passengers and acknowledge a mistake. But now she had no choice. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. "Understood," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Good. Then get to it." Margaret turned stiffly on her heel and stepped out of the cockpit, her polished shoes clicking against the floor as she walked through first class. She could feel the weight of the moment already settling over her, the silent judgment of passengers who had watched everything unfold. Her usual confident stride felt unnatural now. Every step toward the economy section was heavier than the last. As she reached the aisle where Elena was seated, the murmurs around her grew louder. Some passengers were pretending not to notice, eyes glued to their books or screens, but others were openly watching. Waiting. Margaret stopped beside Elena's row and took a breath before speaking. "Elena," she said, her voice carefully measured, "there was a mistake." Elena looked up, her expression unreadable. "A mistake?" Margaret forced herself to nod. "Yes. You were removed from your seat in error. I am here to escort you back to first class." A silence settled between them. Elena didn't move. The passengers nearby had gone completely still, their attention locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Margaret could feel their eyes burning into her, but the worst part was Elena's silence. The teenager simply watched her as if waiting for something more. Something Margaret wasn't ready to give. "Elena," she tried again, her voice tight. "Your father has requested that you return to your seat." Elena tilted her head slightly. "My father?" she echoed. "Or the airline?" Margaret stiffened. She knew what the girl was doing. Elena wasn't just going to let this slide. Margaret exhaled slowly, forcing the words out like they physically hurt. I apologize for the inconvenience." The words hung in the air, hollow and detached. It was an apology in form but not in substance. Elena arched a brow. Inconvenience? Margaret's stomach twisted. She had handled hundreds of difficult passengers over the years, but none had ever made her feel this exposed. She forced herself to meet Elena's gaze. "I apologize for my actions," she said, the words slower this time, though they still felt foreign on her tongue. "I made an assumption I shouldn't have." A beat of silence. Then Elena finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down for her backpack and stood up. She didn't say thank you. She didn't acknowledge Margaret's forced apology. She simply stepped into the aisle, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. And then she walked back toward first class, this time with every eye on her. Margaret followed closely behind, the humiliation of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just about escorting Elena back to first class. It was about undoing what she had done, publicly. And for the first time in her career, Margaret Collins wasn't the one in control. Margaret swallowed hard, the silence stretching between her and Elena like an invisible force. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing down on her, their hushed whispers filling the gaps where words failed. Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone measured. Margaret forced herself to nod. Yes, she said, though even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. There was an error and I need to correct it. Elena remained still, her gaze locked onto Margaret's with quiet intensity. An error, she echoed, voice calm but firm. And what kind of error was that? Margaret's throat tightened. She had been hoping this would be quick. A simple acknowledgement, a quiet return to first class, and then she could disappear from the scrutiny of the cabin. But Elena wasn't making this easy. Margaret exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. I made an assumption I shouldn't have, she admitted. And I handled the situation poorly. A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. Elena studied her for a long moment before finally moving. She reached for her backpack, adjusting the strap over her shoulder, but she didn't stand up just yet. You didn't answer my question, she said. What kind of error was it? Margaret's pulse quickened. She knew what Elena was asking. The girl wasn't looking for a half-hearted apology, she wanted the truth. Margaret felt her palms grow clammy. She could feel the heat of everyone watching, waiting. Her entire career had been built on authority, on confidence. Now for the first time she was being forced to confront her own failure. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. I assumed you didn't belong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Another hush fell over the cabin. Elena held her gaze for a moment longer, then, finally, she stood up. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she slung her backpack over one shoulder and stepped into the aisle. Then, with quiet composure, she turned to Margaret and asked, Are you going to walk me back? Margaret's stomach twisted. Yes, she answered. Elena nodded once. Then, without another word, she began walking toward first class. The passengers in economy shifted as she passed, some casting guilty glances, others openly watching. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Margaret followed behind, every step feeling heavier than the last. She could hear the soft murmurs growing louder as they moved through the cabin, past the dividing curtain and back into first class. When they reached Elena's original seat, the girl settled in without a word, calmly placing her bag beside her. She didn't thank Margaret. She didn't need to. Margaret hesitated, unsure of what to say next. If there's anything you need, she started, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Elena didn't look up. She simply opened the in-flight magazine and flipped to the next page. Message received. Margaret stood there for a beat longer, her face burning with humiliation, before turning and retreating toward the galley. She had never felt smaller in her entire career. And something told her, this was only the beginning. Elena stepped back into the first-class cabin, her posture straight, her expression calm. She didn't need to say a word. The silence that followed her spoke louder than anything else. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier indifference now replaced with quiet guilt. A few looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their in-flight entertainment. Others stole cautious glances as if unsure whether they should acknowledge what had happened, or ignore it just as they had before. Margaret followed closely behind, her presence a stark contrast to the confidence Elena carried. She felt the judgmental gazes aimed at her, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. She had always commanded authority in the cabin, but now she felt like an intruder in her own space. Elena reached her seat and settled in without hesitation. She placed her bag neatly beside her, adjusted her hoodie and crossed her legs. It was as if she had never been asked to leave at all. Margaret hesitated, standing awkwardly beside her. If there's anything I can get for you, she offered, though the words felt empty. Elena didn't look up. You already said that? Margaret's jaw tightened. She was used to controlling situations, to handling passengers with smooth, rehearsed responses. But Elena wasn't a problem to be handled. She was a reminder of Margaret's mistake. A few seats away, an older businessman, Richard Evans, adjusted his tie uncomfortably. He had watched everything unfold, had seen Elena's quiet defiance and Margaret's reluctant submission. He exhaled slowly and leaned forward. He began awkwardly, his voice just above a whisper. I should have said something earlier. Elena turned her head slightly, finally looking at him. But you didn't? Richard swallowed, his fingers tapping against the armrest. No, I didn't. He hesitated, then nodded. And I regret that. For the first time since returning to her seat, Elena's expression shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. Just quiet acknowledgement. She didn't offer him reassurance, didn't let him off the hook with a simple it's okay. Because it wasn't. Instead, she simply said, You'll remember next time. Richard gave a slow nod. I will. Margaret, still standing, clenched her hands at her sides. She wasn't sure what she had expected. A sense of closure, maybe? A sign that this moment would pass and things would return to normal? But nothing about this felt normal. She had made a decision and now she had to live with the consequences. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the galley, feeling the burn of every eye that followed her. And for the first time in her career, Margaret Collins knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the aisle. Elena flipped through the in-flight magazine absent-mindedly, her fingers idly turning the glossy pages without actually reading anything. She wasn't thinking about travel destinations or luxury resorts. She was thinking about what had just happened, and how the entire energy of the cabin had shifted. The same passengers who had been indifferent before were now stealing glances at her. Some looked away the moment her eyes flickered in their direction. Others seemed almost embarrassed, as if realizing, too late, that they had witnessed something they should have spoken up about. She exhaled slowly, pressing the magazine closed. She wasn't interested in their guilt. Across the aisle, Richard Evans sat stiffly in his seat, his hands clasped together. Every few moments, he would glance toward her, as if debating whether or not to say something else. Elena didn't give him the satisfaction of making it easier for him. If he wanted to speak, he could do it without her help. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, willing herself to breathe evenly. Her hand still trembled slightly, the sting of humiliation refusing to fade. She had done what was required of her, apologized, walked Elena back, taken the public disgrace without protest. And yet she knew it wasn't enough. Not for Daniel Carter. Not for herself. She felt Hannah's presence before she heard her voice. That was painful to watch, Hannah remarked casually, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Margaret's jaw clenched. I don't need your commentary right now. Hannah took a slow sip, eyeing her over the rim of the cup. Margaret shot her a sharp glare. Right, of course, but Hannah didn't seem fazed. Because everything's going so well for you. Instead, she leaned against the counter, studying her like she was some kind of puzzle. You know, Hannah mused, I've worked with you for years. I've seen you enforce rules, hold your ground, put passengers in their place. But I've never seen you look like this. Margaret stiffened. Like what? Like someone who just realized they're not untouchable. The words hit harder than Margaret expected. She turned away, filling a cup with water and taking a small, measured sip. I was just doing my job, she muttered. Hannah raised an eyebrow. Were you? Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. Because for the first time she wasn't entirely sure. Silence stretched between them before Hannah spoke again, her voice quieter this time. You think Carter's going to let this slide? Margaret swallowed hard. No. Good, Hannah said simply. Then maybe you should start thinking about what comes next. Margaret didn't reply. She just stared at the water in her cup, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. Because she already knew, this wasn't over. And when they landed, she would have to face the consequences. Margaret exhaled slowly, setting the phone down with a trembling hand. The weight of Daniel Carter's words settled heavily in her chest. A full incident report. Complete accountability. No room for excuses. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself, but the realization hit her like turbulence in clear skies. There was no talking her way out of this. As the plane continued its smooth journey through the sky, the tension inside the cabin only thickened. Margaret could feel it. Every time she stepped out of the galley, the air felt heavier, the looks from passengers sharper. She had lost control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Elena casually scrolled through her phone, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. 45 minutes until landing. She took another glance around the cabin. The energy had shifted, not in her favor but against Margaret. It was subtle but undeniable. Passengers who once ignored her were now paying attention. And that, she realized, was more powerful than any argument she could have made. Richard Evans, the businessman, still sat stiffly in his seat, swirling the last remnants of his drink in his glass. A mistake or a choice? Elena's words clearly still lingered with him. She didn't need to say anything else. She had made her point. At the front of the plane, Margaret forced herself to move, forcing herself to do what came next. She needed to act as if nothing had changed. She stepped out of the galley, adjusting her uniform, and made her way toward first class, carrying a tray with a glass of sparkling water. She stopped at Elena's seat. Miss Carter, she said, her voice controlled but missing its usual authority, your drink? Elena slowly looked up, then at the glass in Margaret's hand. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. You didn't ask me if I wanted anything, she said, her tone calm. Like you did with everyone else? Margaret's grip on the tray tightened. I'm asking now. Elena studied her for a moment before finally reaching for the glass. She took a small sip, then set it down on the tray table beside her. Margaret stood there, unsure whether to say something else or simply walk away. Elena spared her one last glance before turning her attention back to her phone. Margaret got the message. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the front of the cabin, her face burning. The rest of this flight would feel like the longest of her career. And she knew when they landed it wouldn't be over. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as Elena's words settled in the air between them. She had no response. She had spent years enforcing policies, ensuring that first class remained exclusive to those she believed belonged. But now for the first time she was being asked to explain herself. And the truth? She had no good answer. Elena didn't press further. She simply let the silence stretch, let Margaret feel the weight of her own actions. I apologize if I wasn't as welcoming, Margaret finally forced out. The words felt awkward, unnatural, and she knew Elena could hear it too. Elena studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, unreadable nod. Noted. She took another slow sip of her drink, then casually turned her gaze back to her phone. Conversation over. Margaret lingered for a second, uncertain. What was she expecting? Forgiveness? Realizing there was nothing more to say, she turned stiffly and walked back toward the galley, each step feeling heavier than the last. Hannah was still leaning against the beverage cart when Margaret returned, her arms crossed, an amused expression playing at the edges of her lips. That looked painful, she remarked. Margaret shot her a warning glare. Not now, Hannah. But Hannah just smirked. You know, I think she handled that better than you did. Margaret exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temple. She wasn't in the mood for this. She just needed this flight to be over. But even as she stood there trying to push everything down, she knew the real turbulence was still ahead. Because when they landed, she would have to answer to Daniel Carter. And there was no escaping that. Margaret sat frozen in the galley, her mind racing as the reality of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a difficult passenger complaint. This wasn't something she could brush off with corporate jargon or vague apologies. She had crossed the wrong person. And now she was at the mercy of Daniel Carter. The steady hum of the engines filled the air, but it did little to calm the storm inside her. She had spent years navigating tense situations, defusing conflicts, controlling the cabin. But now she was the one being controlled. Hannah, still standing nearby, casually sipped her coffee, watching Margaret with an expression that was far too amused given the circumstances. You know, Hannah mused, tilting her head, I don't think I've ever seen you this rattled before. Margaret clenched her jaw. Hannah? Hannah smirked, unfazed. What? I'm just making an observation. It's not every day you get called out by the owner of the airline. She took another slow sip. And his daughter, apparently. Margaret exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. I don't need your commentary. Hannah raised an eyebrow. No, but you probably need a plan. Margaret didn't respond. She knew there was no plan that could fix this. Not anymore. Meanwhile, back in first class, Elena was still scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered. She had already won the moment she sent that first text to her father. Now, she was just waiting for the landing. Passengers around her were still aware of her presence in a way they hadn't been before. Some stole nervous glances, others avoided looking at her altogether. The weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. No one was going to forget this flight anytime soon. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. Dad, we land in 30 minutes. Sit tight. Elena smirked slightly as she typed back. Me, I'm good. Just watching things unfold. She set her phone down, folded her arms, and leaned back into her seat, letting the soft hum of the plane that settle over. Felt like a countdown Margaret, to the inevitable. On the other hand, wasn't feeling so relaxed. She knew what was waiting for her when they landed. And she had never dreaded an arrival more. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign overhead signaled the beginning of descent. But for her, it felt like the beginning of the end. Passengers around the cabin moved with ease, adjusting their seats, shutting down their devices, chatting quietly. For them this was just another landing. But for Margaret, it was a countdown to her reckoning. Hannah, still leaning casually against the beverage cart, studied her with mild curiosity. So, she mused, are you going to tell me what that call was about, or should I just assume the worst? Margaret didn't respond immediately. What was there to say? Daniel Carter hadn't just reprimanded her. He had effectively grounded her. While the rest of the crew would disembark as usual, she would be left behind, waiting for security. Waiting for whatever consequences came next. I'm not getting off the plane, she admitted finally, her voice hollow. Hannah blinked. Wait, what? Margaret swallowed hard. Security is meeting me at the gate? For the first time, Hannah looked genuinely surprised. Damn. Margaret didn't have the energy to snap back. She just kept staring at the floor, the pressure in her chest growing heavier by the second. How had it come to this? Meanwhile, back in first class, Elena shifted in her seat, stretching slightly as the plane dipped lower. She could feel the change in cabin pressure, the way the air subtly tightened around them. Almost there. Her phone buzzed once more. Dad, we'll be at the gate when you land. Just sit tight. She smirked, slipping the phone into her hoodie pocket. She wasn't worried. She had played her part. Now it was time to let things unfold. Across the aisle, Richard Evans glanced over again. He looked like he wanted to say something else but thought better of it. Good. She didn't need any more half-hearted apologies. The plane continued its descent, city lights twinkling below as the runway came into view. The hum of the engines softened, the familiar shift in momentum signaling that touchdown was imminent. Margaret remained in the galley, frozen in place. For years she had ruled this space. She had been the enforcer, the authority, the one who dictated the rules. Now, she was just another person waiting to be told what to do. And for the first time in her career, she had no idea what was coming next. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears as she faced the officer. The murmurs from the passengers only made it worse. She had been the one enforcing order, and now she was the spectacle. She squared her shoulders, desperately trying to maintain what little composure she had left. Is this really necessary? She asked, forcing her voice to stay even. The officer's expression didn't change. Mr. Carter has requested your presence for a formal review. Margaret swallowed hard. A review. She had no illusions about what that meant. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. She hesitated, glancing around the cabin. She could feel the eyes on her. First-class passengers who had ignored Elena before now openly watched. Economy passengers craned their necks, sensing something was happening but unsure what. She was the center of attention in the worst possible way. Hannah, still standing near the galley, gave her a pointed look. No smirk this time. No teasing remark. Just quiet acknowledgement of the situation. Margaret took a shaky breath. She had no choice. Yes, of course, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. The officer stepped aside, gesturing toward the exit. Margaret walked forward, feeling the weight of every step. As she passed through first class, her gaze flickered toward Elena. Elena didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched, calm and composed, as if she had expected this outcome all along. Margaret wanted to say something, to defend herself, to offer an excuse, but what was the point? Elena had already won. She kept walking. Passengers parted as she moved through the cabin, whispers following her like an echo. The moment she stepped through the exit, the officer leading the way, Margaret knew her career would never be the same. Back in first class, Elena exhaled softly, finally unbuckling her seatbelt as passengers began gathering their belongings. Her phone buzzed one last time. Dad, we're here. See you soon. She smiled slightly, standing up and stretching. It was over. At least for her. For Margaret? It was just beginning. Margaret's heart pounded as she stepped into the conference room. The door shut behind her with a soft click, sealing her inside. No passengers. No cabin crew. No escape. The room was cold, clinical, designed for efficiency, not comfort. A long table stretched across the center, a few neatly arranged chairs surrounding it. The airline's logo gleamed on the far wall, a silent reminder of the institution she had served for years. Now, that same institution was about to decide her fate. The two executives who had greeted her at the jet bridge took their seats across from her. The man with silver hair, clearly the senior of the two, folded his hands on the table. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp gaze told Margaret this wasn't just a formality. She sat stiffly, forcing her hands to remain still in her lap. Show control. Show professionalism. She had handled difficult situations before. She could handle this. The silver-haired executive cleared his throat. Miss Collins, I assume you understand why we're here. Margaret swallowed hard. Yes, sir. He nodded. Good. He glanced at the younger executive beside him, a woman with a crisp navy blazer and a tablet in front of her. She tapped the screen, then turned it toward Margaret. A security feed played, a silent recording of her interaction with Elena. Margaret's stomach twisted. She didn't need to hear the words to remember exactly what she had said, the assumptions she had made, the way she had dismissed a valid ticket. The video ended. The room was silent. The younger executive finally spoke, her voice even. Miss Collins, do you have anything to say for yourself? Margaret opened her mouth, then hesitated. What could she say? That she had made a mistake? That she had followed instinct over procedure? That she had never thought twice before today? She clenched her jaw. I was enforcing policy. The silver-haired executive's expression didn't change. Was that truly what you were doing? Margaret's breath hitched. The younger executive didn't look away. Because from what we see here, you weren't enforcing policy. You were making a decision based on an assumption. Silence. Margaret gripped the edges of her seat, forcing herself to stay composed. The silver-haired man leaned forward. Mr. Carter has made his position on this matter clear. There will be an internal review, and until that process is complete. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. You are suspended from duty, effective immediately. Margaret's breath caught. She had known this was coming. She had feared it. But hearing the words out loud, the finality of it, made her stomach churn. The younger executive slid a folder across the table. You'll find details of your suspension here. You will also be required to complete additional training before any consideration of reinstatement. Margaret barely nodded, her hands trembling as she took the folder. The silver-haired man stood. That will be all, Miss Collins. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She rose, nodding stiffly before turning toward the door. Her career, everything she had built, was hanging by a thread. And Elena Carter had been the one to pull it. How could she argue when the evidence was right in front of her? Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers tightening against the arms of the chair. She had no defense. James Connor didn't break eye contact, his expression unreadable but firm. I've reviewed your record, Miss Collins, he continued. Up until now you've maintained a clean file. No formal complaints. No major incidents. Margaret clung to that statement, hoping it meant there was still a way out of this. But, James said, his voice cutting through her thoughts, this isn't something we can overlook. Margaret's stomach dropped. The younger executive, the woman with the navy blazer, finally spoke. Miss Collins, what concerns us most isn't just that you removed Elena Carter from her seat, she said, her tone measured. It's that you didn't question why you assumed she didn't belong there. Margaret's jaw tightened. James raised a hand, silencing her. If you had taken the proper steps, checked the manifest, verified the ticket with the gate, you wouldn't be sitting in this room. He leaned back slightly. But you didn't? Margaret forced herself to breathe evenly. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. She straightened her shoulders, summoning whatever confidence she had left. I understand the gravity of the situation, she said carefully. I made an error in judgment and I take full responsibility. James studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether he believed her. Then he nodded. Good, he said. Because here's what's going to happen. Margaret braced herself. You are officially suspended, effective immediately, James continued. The duration of your suspension will be determined after a full review. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she stayed silent. The woman in the navy blazer slid another folder across the table. Additionally, before you can return to duty, if you are reinstated, you will be required to complete extensive retraining, including bias awareness and passenger relations. Margaret's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Suspended. Forced to undergo retraining. Everything she had worked for, years of experience, seniority, control, was slipping away. James exhaled, his tone softening slightly. Look, Margaret. I don't believe you're a bad flight attendant. She blinked in surprise. But you made a choice, he continued. And that choice had consequences. Silence stretched between them. Margaret lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. There was nothing left to say. Do you understand the terms of your suspension? James asked. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. Yes, sir. James gave a short nod. Then you're dismissed? Margaret hesitated for just a second before standing. She gathered the folder with stiff fingers, then turned toward the door. As she stepped out into the hallway, the weight of everything crashed down on her. She had walked into this meeting as a senior flight attendant. Now, she didn't even know if she had a future with the airline. And worst of all, Elena Carter had barely needed to say a word to bring her to this moment. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand despite the weakness in her legs. This couldn't be happening. She had spent a decade building her career, enforcing the rules, making sure everything ran exactly as it should. And now she was being escorted out like a disgraced employee. The security officer didn't say a word, simply waiting for her to move. James Connor gave her one final look, not cruel, not smug, just final. "This is your chance to decide who you're going to be moving forward, Miss Collins," he said. "I suggest you don't waste it." Margaret clenched her jaw but said nothing. Anything she said now would be meaningless. She turned toward the door, stepping out into the quiet, sterile hallway. Her shoes clicked against the polished floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the empty space. Every step felt heavier than the last. The security officer walked beside her, not rushing, not speaking, just making sure she left the building without issue. As she passed through the private corridors of the airport, a few employees turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their expressions. Margaret had walked these halls 100 times before, always with confidence. Always with purpose. Now she felt like she was walking toward an uncertain future. At the terminal exit, the officer finally stopped. "This is where we part ways, Miss Collins," he said, his tone neutral. "You'll receive further instructions via email." Margaret nodded stiffly. "Understood." She stepped forward, pushing through the heavy glass doors and out into the crisp night air. The terminal lights flickered against the pavement, the city beyond humming with life. She had no idea where to go. No idea what came next. All she knew was that her career, her entire identity, was now hanging by a thread. And for the first time in years, Margaret Collins was completely and utterly lost. Elena sat in the plush leather chair, the quiet hum of the first-class lounge settling around her like white noise. She appeared calm, her posture relaxed, but her mind was still processing everything that had unfolded in the last few hours. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. She had won. But it wasn't about winning, it never had been. It was about being seen. About proving that no one should be treated the way she had been. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. "Dad, we're on our way in. Stay put." She smirked slightly, taking a sip of the tea an attendant had brought her. Across the lounge, a few passengers were watching her, not in an intrusive way but with quiet curiosity. Some had been on the flight, had witnessed her humiliation and the aftermath. They knew exactly who she was now. And they knew exactly what had happened to the woman who had underestimated her. She let them look. Let them sit with their thoughts. A moment later, the doors to the lounge parted and Daniel Carter strode in. His presence commanded the space instantly, calm, composed, but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. Elena set her cup down and stood. Her father's gaze swept over her, checking, not for injuries but for any lingering wounds that couldn't be seen. "You okay?" he asked, his voice even. Elena nodded. "Yeah." Daniel studied her for a beat longer, then exhaled through his nose. "Good." She knew her father well enough to know what that meant. He was furious but not at her. Elena glanced past him toward the lounge entrance. "What happened to her?" she asked, though she already had a good idea. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Suspended, pending further review." She tilted her head slightly. "Fired?" "That's up to the board," Daniel said. "But her career with this airline is over. She'll never work another flight for us again." Elena absorbed that for a moment. It wasn't surprising, and yet, it felt strange knowing that her actions had set that in motion. "I didn't need her to lose her job," she said finally. Daniel's expression softened, just a fraction. "That's not on you, Elena. She made her own choices." She nodded slowly, but something inside her still felt unsettled. Because she had meant what she said on the plane. This wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about why it had happened in the first place. And Margaret Collins wasn't the only one who needed to think about that. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." Elena picked up her bag and followed him toward the exit, stepping out of the lounge knowing she wasn't leaving this experience behind. She was taking it with her. And next time? She wouldn't be the one caught off guard. Elena tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, deep in thought. "She didn't think she was wrong," she murmured. "Not at first." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the problem with people like her. They don't see it until it's too late." Elena considered that for a moment. "And if she still doesn't?" Daniel leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Then she'll learn the hard way." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. Elena sighed. "I guess we'll see what she does next." Her father studied her carefully. "And what about you?" She blinked. "What about me?" Daniel gave her a knowing look. "You had a whole cabin of people watching that unfold. Some spoke up. Most didn't. What are you going to do with that?" Elena frowned slightly. "I wasn't planning on doing anything with it." Daniel tilted his head. "No?" She hesitated. What was he getting at? "Look," he continued, "you handled yourself well back there. You didn't lose your temper. You didn't cause a scene. You just let the truth speak for itself? He exhaled. But the fact that it had to speak at all, that no one else said anything until it was too late, that's the real problem. Elena sat back, crossing her arms. I can't fix people, Dad. No, Daniel agreed. But you can make them think. She fell quiet. He let her sit with that thought for a moment before glancing at his watch. Come on, let's go home. Elena nodded, grabbing her bag. As they stood, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really, because her father was right. People like Margaret Collins didn't change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, this time someone would. And that was worth something. Hannah let out a low whistle. Well, you might want to do that fast. The board isn't going to drag this out forever. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. What do you want, Hannah? There was a pause. Honestly? I don't know. I thought maybe you'd be more. I don't know. Angry? Defensive? Something other than sitting in the dark feeling sorry for yourself? Margaret's jaw tightened. What do you expect me to do? March into the boardroom and demand my job back? No, Hannah said, but I expected you to have a plan. The Margaret Collins I know never lets anyone tell her she's done, not without a fight. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaustion weighing on her. She wanted to fight. She wanted to march in and argue her case, tell them she had been enforcing rules, that she had made a mistake but didn't deserve to lose everything over it. But deep down she knew the truth. Hannah wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about Elena Carter. This was about why she had made the choice she did. And if she couldn't admit that, to herself or to anyone else, then maybe she didn't deserve to fight for her job. Hannah's voice softened slightly. Look, I know you don't want to hear this, but maybe this is the wake-up call you needed. Margaret didn't respond. After a beat, Hannah sighed. You figure out what you're gonna do, all right? The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone for a long moment before setting it down. The city outside her window kept moving, oblivious to the fact that her world had just been turned upside down. She glanced back at her laptop screen, the words pending further review glaring at her. A week ago she had been untouchable. Now she had to decide who she was going to be when the review was over. And for the first time in 10 years she wasn't sure of the answer. A chance to explain herself. A chance to fight for her job. A chance to change. Margaret exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. She wasn't used to this feeling. The feeling of being on the other side of scrutiny, of having her decisions picked apart. Of being wrong. She had told herself for years that she was just doing her job. Enforcing rules. Maintaining order. But now, for the first time, she had to ask herself, had those rules applied to everyone equally? The answer made her stomach twist. She leaned forward, staring at the unopened email from the airline's HR department. They were giving her a chance to respond. Not to defend herself, not if she wanted any hope of redemption, but to acknowledge what had happened. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. What was she supposed to say? I didn't mean to? That wasn't true. I was just following protocol? That was a lie too. She had seen Elena Carter and made a decision. Without checking, without verifying, without even considering that she belonged in that seat. And now the only question left was, could she admit it? Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. For years, she had demanded accountability from passengers. Expected them to follow rules without question. Now, accountability was being asked of her. She took a deep breath, then, slowly began typing. To Human Resources. Subject. Formal response, incident review. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote. But this time, for the first time in her career, she wasn't just trying to save herself. She was finally telling the truth. Margaret stood, smoothing her palms against her skirt before walking toward the conference room. Each step felt heavier than the last. She had spent the night thinking about what she would say, rehearsing different versions of an apology. But nothing had felt right. Because for the first time in her career, words alone wouldn't fix this. The door loomed in front of her. The receptionist gave her a short nod before pushing it open. Inside the room was quiet. Professional. A long polished table stretched across the center, sunlight filtering through the massive windows overlooking the city skyline. And at the far end of the table sat Daniel Carter. Elena was beside him, her posture relaxed but her expression unreadable. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look smug. Somehow that made it worse. Margaret hesitated for half a second before stepping inside. The door shut behind her, sealing her fate. Daniel gestured toward the chair across from them. Sit. Margaret obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been in boardrooms before, but never like this. Never as the person being judged. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You asked for this meeting, he said. We're listening. Margaret took a shaky breath. No turning back now. She looked at Elena first. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice quiet but firm. A real one? Elena didn't react, just waited. Margaret swallowed hard and continued. I made a judgment about you the second I saw you. I assumed you didn't belong in first class. I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify your ticket. I just decided. The words felt like glass in her throat, but she forced them out. And that was wrong, she admitted. I humiliated you. I made you feel like you had to prove something that no one else in that cabin had to prove. That wasn't enforcing policy. That was bias. For the first time, Elena's expression shifted. Just slightly. Daniel studied Margaret carefully. And why are you saying this now? Margaret exhaled. Because I don't want to be the kind of person who pretends this didn't happen. And because if I ever get the chance to wear that uniform again, I need to be better. Silence stretched between them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Elena finally spoke. You can't change what happened, she said. But you can decide what you do next. Margaret nodded, accepting the truth in those words. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. Then finally he spoke. The board will review your case, he said. No guarantees. But I'll make sure they know about this conversation. Margaret felt a rush of something she hadn't expected. Not relief, but something close to it. A chance. She stood, nodding respectfully to both of them. Thank you, she said quietly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the conference room. Her fate was no longer in her hands. But for the first time she hoped, really hoped, that she had taken the first step toward earning back something more than just her job. No, it wouldn't. Margaret knew that now. An apology didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the humiliation she had caused. She took a slow breath, meeting Daniel Carter's gaze. I don't expect forgiveness, she admitted. And I don't expect my job back. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't interrupt. Margaret turned to Elena, her expression steady. But I don't want this to be the last conversation I have about it. I need to do better. I need to unlearn the things that made me make that decision in the first place. Elena didn't react right away, but Margaret could tell she was considering her words carefully. Margaret hesitated before continuing. I've spent years enforcing rules, making sure everything ran smoothly. But I never stopped to think about who those rules affected, or how my own assumptions shaped the way I enforced them. She exhaled. That changes now. A beat of silence passed. Then Elena finally spoke. How? Margaret swallowed. I start by learning. By listening. By accepting that just because I didn't mean harm doesn't mean I didn't cause it. She let out a breath. And if I ever get the chance to put my uniform back on, I'll make sure I never make someone feel the way I made you feel that day. Elena studied her, then nodded slowly. Good, she said simply. Margaret didn't know what she had expected. But somehow, that one word felt heavier than anything else that had been said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. The board will make their decision soon, he said. I won't make any promises, but I will let them know about this conversation. Margaret nodded. That's all I can ask for. Daniel regarded her for a moment longer, then stood. That's all for now. Margaret rose to her feet, glancing at Elena one last time. Thank you, she said quietly, then turned and walked out of the room. As she stepped into the hallway, she exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't the end of her journey. But for the first time she was finally walking in the right direction. Margaret's stomach twisted as she flipped through the pages. There were more complaints than she expected. Some were vague, mentions of her being cold or unhelpful. Others were more direct. The flight attendant treated me differently than the other passengers. She ignored my request but helped the person next to me immediately. I felt like I had to prove I belonged in first class. Margaret's breath felt shallow. How had she never seen these? She looked up at Daniel. I didn't know. Daniel's gaze was unreadable. Did you ever think to ask? Margaret swallowed hard. The answer was obvious. No, she hadn't. Elena leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. This wasn't just about me, she said. It never was. Margaret knew that now. This wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern. Daniel exhaled, his tone measured but firm. You say you want to be better. That you want to learn. But do you actually understand what that means? Margaret's fingers clenched around the edge of the folder. She could feel the weight of every complaint pressing down on her. She had always seen herself as a professional. Efficient. Experienced. Good at her job. But now, for the first time, she wondered, Had she been blind to her own faults this entire time? She took a shaky breath. I want to understand, she admitted. I know I can't erase what I've done, but I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. I don't want to be this kind of person. Elena studied her for a long moment. And what are you willing to do about it? Margaret hesitated. What was she willing to do? She looked at Daniel, then back at Elena. Whatever it takes. Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel nodded once as if he had expected that answer. Then let's see if you mean it. I'm giving you the opportunity to earn one. Margaret sat frozen, the weight of Daniel Carter's words pressing down on her. This wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped up in a neat package. It was a test. And she had no idea if she would pass. She exhaled slowly, glancing down at the folder in front of her. All those complaints. The years of unchecked behavior, of decisions she had made without even realizing their impact. Or maybe she had realized it but had never been forced to confront it. Until now. Elena, still sitting back in her chair, tilted her head slightly. So, what's it going to be? Margaret's fingers tightened around the edges of the folder. Walking away would be easier. She could find another airline, start fresh, pretend none of this had ever happened. But pretending wouldn't change the truth. If she left now, she wouldn't just be running from her mistakes, she'd be carrying them with her. Margaret took a slow breath and met Daniel's gaze. What would this work look like? Daniel's expression remained unreadable. Bias training. Passenger relations courses. Shadowing senior crew members. Ones who don't have a history of complaints like yours? Margaret swallowed. That alone was a blow. Daniel continued. You'll also be required to meet with some of the passengers who filed complaints, if they're willing. He paused, his gaze sharp. And when the board reviews your case in a few months, your progress, or lack of it, will determine if you ever wear that uniform again. The message was clear. This wasn't just about keeping her job. It was about proving she deserved it. Margaret sat back, the air in the room suddenly feeling too heavy. This was more than she had expected. More than she was sure she could handle. But what was the alternative? She looked at Elena, who still hadn't broken eye contact. There was no smugness there, no sense of victory. Just a challenge. Margaret exhaled. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. Daniel gave a curt nod. Then you'll hear from my office with the details? Elena studied her for another moment, then simply said, We'll see. Margaret nodded stiffly, standing from her chair. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but she ignored it. As she turned toward the door, she knew one thing for certain. Walking out of this room wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Voice steadier now. I wasn't just enforcing the rules, I was choosing who they applied to. And I never questioned why. Silence settled over the room, thick with unspoken meaning. She had finally said it. Daniel studied her carefully, as if weighing her words, measuring how much of them were genuine. Elena, still quiet, leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. She had heard apologies before. She had heard promises to do better. But would this be different? Margaret took another breath. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore, she admitted. And if that means putting in the work, really facing what I've done, then I will. Elena tilted her head slightly. Even if after all of that you still don't get your job back? Margaret swallowed. The thought had crossed her mind. What if she did everything right, changed, learned, and still, it wasn't enough? She nodded. Even then. Another beat of silence. Then Daniel exhaled, nodding once. All right. Margaret's shoulders tensed as she braced for what came next. You'll receive a detailed plan outlining your training, Daniel continued. Bias education, passenger relations, real accountability measures. You'll be assigned to a mentor. Someone with a record of excellence in handling passenger interactions. Margaret nodded, absorbing every word. She expected this. Daniel's gaze sharpened. And you'll also be meeting with some of the passengers who filed complaints? Margaret's breath caught. Meeting with them? Elena finally spoke again, her voice even. You've been reading their words on paper, she said. Now you're going to hear them say it to your face. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. That would be the hardest part. Hearing them. Looking them in the eye. Knowing she had made them feel small. But if she wanted to change, she had to face it. She lifted her chin. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. Daniel gave a curt nod. Then let's see if you mean it. With that, the meeting was over. Margaret stood, feeling the weight of everything she had just agreed to. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time she knew it would be worth it. And as she turned toward the door, she realized something else. This wasn't about saving her career anymore. It was about saving herself. Margaret had listened as passengers, some of whom had filed complaints against her, shared their experiences, their frustration, their humiliation. She had sat there, unable to argue, unable to defend herself because there was nothing to defend. She had thought bias training would be a simple process. Watch a few videos, read a few articles, pass a test. It wasn't. It was uncomfortable. Confronting. It forced her to acknowledge things about herself that she had never wanted to see. And now, after 3 months of hard lessons and self-reflection, she was standing outside the same corporate office where this all began, waiting to find out if any of it had been enough. Taking a steadying breath, she adjusted her blazer and stepped inside. The receptionist glanced up and gave a polite nod. "Miss Collins, they're expecting you." Margaret nodded in return, then walked toward the conference room, gripping the folder in her hands as if it might steady her nerves. Inside, Daniel Carter sat at the head of the table just as he had months ago. Elena was beside him, her expression unreadable. 2 other executives were also present, likely members of the review board. Margaret took her seat, exhaling slowly. Daniel folded his hands in front of him. 3 months ago you asked for a chance to prove yourself, he said. You've completed the requirements. But training means nothing if nothing actually changes. Margaret swallowed hard but nodded. I understand. One of the executives flipped through her file. Your instructor said you actively participated in discussions. They said you asked questions. Engaged with the material. Margaret nodded again. I did. Elena spoke up for the first time. What did you actually learn? Margaret turned to face her. That what I did on that flight wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a pattern. One that I wasn't even aware of. Elena studied her, waiting. Margaret took a deep breath. I learned that intent doesn't matter as much as impact. That I was enforcing rules unfairly, sometimes without realizing it, sometimes without caring. I learned that my authority was never supposed to be about control, but about service. And that I failed at that. Daniel exchanged a glance with Elena, then looked back at Margaret. So what happens if we reinstate you? What changes? Margaret didn't hesitate. Everything. A brief silence. Then Daniel reached for a document and slid it across the table. You'll return to work next week, he said. As agreed, you'll start at a lower rank. No seniority, no special privileges. You'll earn your way back. Margaret nodded, accepting the terms. She didn't deserve to walk back into her old position. She needed to start over. Daniel handed her a pen. Sign if you accept. Margaret didn't hesitate this time. She picked up the pen and signed. As she set it down, Elena finally spoke again. Let's see if you mean it. Margaret met her gaze. You will? And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. Margaret sat in the empty conference room for a long moment, letting everything sink in. She had been given a second chance, but it wasn't a gift. It was something she would have to earn. Every single day. She glanced down at the folder Daniel Carter had left on the table. Inside was her new contract, her probationary status clearly outlined. No shortcuts, no seniority, just the opportunity to prove she had changed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel untouchable. She felt human. Margaret finally stood, adjusting her blazer before heading for the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught a glimpse of Elena and Daniel walking toward the exit. Elena glanced back briefly, catching Margaret's eye. Margaret gave a small nod, not one of gratitude, not yet, but of understanding. Elena held her gaze for a second, then smirked slightly before turning away. Margaret exhaled. She still had a long way to go. But for the first time she was ready to walk the path.